sir. Would you please state your full name for the record and spell your last?
Good morning. I'm Dr. Stephen Cogswell. Last name is spelled Cogswell.
What is your profession, sir?
I'm a forensic pathologist and the medical examiner for Hamilton County.
What are the duties and responsibilities of the medical examiner for Hamilton County?
Each one of our 95 counties has an appointed medical examiner. That person's job is to investigate traumatic deaths and suspicious deaths and deaths that have no medical history. In other words, unknown sorts of death. We have a number of other duties that involve cremation approvals, etc., but those aren't really germane to this. In Tennessee, all forensic pathology autopsies or medical examiner autopsies must be done at one of the 5 regional forensic centers. And those 5 are located here in Chattanooga, Johnson City, Knoxville, Nashville, of course, and also Memphis. So every forensic autopsy in Tennessee gets done at one of those 5 places. And that is where your state's forensic pathologists are. Even though all 95 counties have a medical examiner, not all of the medical examiners are forensic pathologists. So our job is basically to investigate those deaths that have some sort of legal bearing and determine cause, manner, and circumstances of death.
Would that be a function that in other states might be called a coroner?
Yes, sir, it is. And in other states where I've worked, I was in fact an elected coroner.
Are there educational requirements to be a medical examiner?
Well, if we say forensic pathologist, because it sort of arose by any other name situation. Just as most of our medical examiners in Tennessee are not forensic pathologists. Forensic pathologists are a relatively scarce breed. There's only about 400 of us in the whole country. And in order to become a forensic pathologist, you must first graduate from medical school and then do a residency program in pathology. Typically that's anatomic and clinical pathology, anatomic pathology being study of tissues. Whenever you go get a biopsy done and it's sent to the lab, that's anatomic pathology. The other major division is clinical pathology, and that would be fluids. So whenever you pee in a cup or get your blood drawn and get sent to the lab, that would be clinical pathology. Under the great pathology umbrella are multiple subspecialties: cardiac pathology, GYN pathology, etc. My subspecialty is forensic pathology, and we are primarily focused on unnatural and trauma deaths. And so forensic pathology, being a subspecialty, you cannot do a forensic pathology fellowship program until you have finished a pathology residency program. So we're talking medical school residency and then a fellowship to become a forensic pathologist. Hence why there's only about 400 of us in the country. In addition, there are obviously, as in every other field, board examinations that are done for each one of the general groups and the specialty or subspecialty groups.
You mentioned medical school. Where did you go to medical school?
At the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston.
What was your undergraduate degree?
My undergraduate degree was a biology degree from the Citadel.
Do you have any experience working in the field of forensic pathology other than the Hamilton County Medical Examiner's Office?
Yes, sir. That's basically all I've ever done. So I'm closing in on 40 years of full-time forensic pathology.
Where did you work before?
I did my fellowship in Miami, Florida, at the medical examiner's office there, and then went on active duty with the Air Force and was assigned to the Armed Forces Medical Examiner's Office until 1998. Their job is basically to act as the federal government's medical examiners, both military and State Department and other federal cases. From there, I went to Louisiana and was deputy coroner in Shreveport and coroner in Bossier City, which is right next door, just across the Red River. From there, I went to the central part of Florida, just above Orlando in the Ocala area. I was medical examiner there for 4 or 5 years, I believe, and then went to Lubbock, Texas. From Lubbock, the forensic pathology group there closed down, so I moved to Knoxville, and from Knoxville was asked to come here to Chattanooga and have been here since 2013.
Is one of the things that a forensic pathologist does perform autopsies?
Yes, sir.
Explain to the jury what an autopsy is.
An autopsy basically is an examination of a dead person, both external and internal, with an eye toward documenting natural disease, trauma, and ultimately coming up with a conclusion as to the cause of death and the manner of death, as well as the circumstances of death. An autopsy is only one part of a death investigation. And basically, it's generating the data to go into that investigation in order for the whole picture to become clear. So the autopsy in and of itself doesn't really tell you the whole story of the person's death. It also requires an investigation. We always say you can't do autopsies in a black box and come up with a good answer.
What type of other things would you want to look at besides just the autopsy as a forensic pathologist?
Well, we're basically doing the very same thing that your doctors do when you go to your doctor. We take a history and a physical. And our history is what is the history, not only of the death, but what is this person's history. If we have a young, healthy person with no natural disease that is known, we don't expect them to die of natural disease, but there may be something hidden in there that we may find at autopsy. On the other hand, if we take an old, broke-down fat guy like me, we expect hypertension, diabetes, a lot of natural disease, and that has to weigh into the conclusion if we're looking at how much trauma is going to be associated with death. In a young, healthy, strong, strapping person, it's going to take a lot of trauma to kill them. In an elderly, frail person, it may take only a very little amount of trauma to cause their death. And so we not only look at the person as far as what their state of health was before they come in, just like when you go to your doctor's office and they say, what diseases do you have? And you check that whole box thing. We're pretty much doing the same thing. But we're also more concerned with the circumstances surrounding the death, just as you are when you go to the doctor's office and they say, well, why are you here? I have this pain here, or whatever the reason is that you came here. They're going to investigate that more deeply. We do that as well. We rely to a large degree on law enforcement as an adjunct to the medical examiner investigators. We don't just have forensic pathologists, we also have trained medical examiner investigators who do the medical part of the death investigation, while law enforcement looks at the evidence and legal part of the death investigation. Ultimately, then, all of the medical information, the pathology information, gets collated with the law enforcement investigation to come up with a coherent picture.
In all, sir, how many autopsy examinations have you performed over the entirety of your career?
Honestly, I have lost count long ago. It is definitely somewhere north of 5,000, probably not quite 10,000. So I usually settle on a middle ground of around 7,000.
On those prior occasions where you had performed autopsy examinations, have they included stab and incised wounds?
Many times, yes, sir.
be able to place a number on that?
I would say it's at least multiple dozens, perhaps as many as 100, maybe not quite that high, but certainly multiple dozens.
Have you received any sort of specialized training that assists you in conducting autopsy examinations?
Well, that's basically the bread and butter of forensic pathology. During the fellowship program, you're trained not only to do the actual physical part of an autopsy, but also to interpret the findings that you see during autopsy. And much of it is didactic training, other parts are hands-on, and other parts are basically experience combined with that training and, quite frankly, a lot of reading. But that really is what the whole Forensic Pathology Fellowship is. That's why it's a year-long program.
Are you a member of any professional organizations dedicated to the study of forensic science?
Yes, sir. The American Academy of Forensic Sciences is a multidisciplinary and, in fact, international, despite the American name, group of forensic scientists, not just pathologists, from around the world. There are subsections. I'm a member in the pathology biology section, but there's also sections for criminalistics and jurisprudence in which there are attorneys, even psychiatry. So we have a very broad range of people networking at these meetings and in this in the group of probably 10,000 or so, perhaps more. I don't really know exactly the number of Academy members.
How long have you been a member of the Academy?
Really since residency, so that would be 1986 or 7.
So nearly 40 years.
Roughly, yes, sir.
Have you ever been qualified to testify as an expert in court?
Yes, sir, multiple times in multiple different venues.
How many times?
Probably over 100 at this point.
And you mentioned multiple venues.
Yes, sir.
What would those be?
Those would be state courts in each of the states in which I've worked, being actually South Carolina, where I did my residency training, as well as Florida, Tennessee, naturally, Texas, and Louisiana, as well as federal court and military courts martial.
On those prior occasions where you have given testimony in all of those various courts, have you always been called by the prosecution?
Not always.
In fact, sir, did you have an opportunity to testify as a defense expert fairly recently in Crammed County?
I did, yes, sir.
In a case where I was the prosecutor.
Yes, sir. That's correct.
Sir, is there anything about your background that makes you particularly suited to conduct autopsy examinations in this particular case?
Well, again, this is part of the forensic pathology training. We not only look at cases of drug overdoses and natural deaths, but also the traumas associated with stab wounds, gunshot wounds, motor vehicle collisions, airplane crashes, house fires, etc. Basically, any of the kind of trauma that you would expect to see in a fairly busy jurisdiction, city, I would say. That's what forensic pathologists are trained to do, so it's part and parcel of our training. Some folks like to semi-specialize, sub-specialize, I suppose, in various areas of forensic pathology. We have some folks who are particularly interested in cardiac pathology. These would be the ones that when you have a sudden cardiac death of someone who's apparently healthy and simply drops dead. Others are more interested in the trauma pathology, and I happen to be one of those. I have a fairly extensive experience in plane crashes and automobile crashes, as well as sharp force and gunshot wound cases.
You mentioned jurisdictions keeping you busy. Does this jurisdiction keep you busy?
It does, yes.
How many autopsies do you perform over the course of a typical week?
It varies widely. Generally speaking, since at this point I am the only medical examiner or forensic pathologist in Hamilton County, last year we did approximately 100 autopsies, and that's about our average, but it fluctuates from the high 70s to as many as 200 per year, not per week. That would be impossible.
Thank you, sir. Your Honor, at this time, the state would consider Dr. Cogswell as an expert in forensic pathology.
Yes. Should the witness be recognized as an expert in forensic pathology?
Sir, as part of your duties and responsibilities as a forensic pathologist, do you sometimes get called to locations to assist in an investigation of the death?
Yes, sir.
Were you working on December the 1st of 2022?
I was.
On that day, did you have an occasion to respond to a location in reference to an item that had been found?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall where you went, sir?
To Suck Creek Road.
Where's Suck Creek Road for the jury?
It's borders the Tennessee River and is a bit north and west down to where we are right now in downtown Chattanooga.
Is that in Hamilton County?
It is.
What did you see when you got there?
Obviously, there were quite a few law enforcement vehicles, and off to the side of the road, adjacent to the river, was a hard-shell suitcase that was laying in the brushwood area just off the shoulder of the road. Near that area were actually a couple of deer carcasses that had been tossed out there after butchering. But in particular, this suitcase was basically the kind that you would take on a relatively extended trip. Large suitcase, on wheels, handle, etc. After all of the documentation, photographic and location issues were resolved by the police department so that they could place it exactly, then the question came up, well, what is in the suitcase? And at that point, the cover of the suitcase, the lid was opened. Inside was a black plastic trash bag. And so using basically just hands, I could feel along the contents of the bag and say, yes, this is not animal or something, this is a human being inside there. At which point then the suitcase was closed back up, it was transported to the medical examiner's office, and at that point then we further examined not just the suitcase but also the contents.
Sir, I'm removing from this box item 173, exhibit 173 to the trial. You recognize this, sir?
Yes, sir. This is the suitcase that was brought to the medical examiner's office.
Is this the same suitcase that you observed along Suck Creek Road adjacent to the Tennessee River?
Yes, sir. It appears to be.
So you take this item with what you felt as human remains inside a garbage bag back to your office. What did you do when you returned to your office?
At that point, before we do anything else, then we're going to start doing photographs and x-rays, because we're going to document everything we're doing as we're doing it in a stepwise fashion, because we don't want to lose evidence. So in x-raying, we basically just laid the suitcase on top of the x-ray plates and x-rayed through the suitcase. And looking at those x-rays, it was evident that there is a deceased person inside, basically in a fetal position, that is drawn with the knees drawn up and the arms crossed across the chest, and fitted into the suitcase. In addition, along with all of the hardware in the suitcase that shows up on X-ray, there's also a triangular metallic density piece that showed up in the area of the chest. And it's something that obviously didn't belong to the suitcase because there's a very regular arrangement of support bars, rivets, etc., that is fairly symmetrical. So after the X-raying was done, then the body was lifted out of the suitcase, and again, it was in black plastic trash bags. And at that point, then the suitcase is laid off to the side. That's no longer of medical examiner interest, that's law enforcement interest. And then I proceeded to cut each of the black plastic trash bags along one side and along the bottom and remove each of those in turn. Turns out there were 3. And as happens to be fairly common, at least in the bodies that I've done, in cases in which I've autopsied, where people have been disposed of in trash bags, it seems like the interior bag is always pulled up from the feet toward the head, and then there's another one down from the head toward the feet, and then there may be a third one, again, feet toward the head. In this case, turns out it was exactly that same way. I guess that's just how humans think. But, so each of those bags is cut off, removed, and that reveals the body of a young woman who is in a fetal position, has no clothing on the top half of her body, and is shackled and handcuffed. Obviously, there's a lot of blood involved in this, and multiple stab wounds and size wounds. And if I may go on a slight tangent here, when we talk in forensic pathology about stab wounds and size wounds, those are 2 different things to us. A stab wound is deeper than it is long, and an incised wound is longer than it is deep. An incised wound is basically a cut. And that tells us 2 different things. You know, we're not dealing with just a sharp, pointy object, but we're dealing with a sharp, pointy object that has an edge. On the other hand, if you just have an object with an edge, like say, for example, a piece of sheet metal, that can cut you very deeply, but it's not really going to stab you unless it's pointy. So that's the distinction that we talk about. So when you hear me go on automatically about stab versus incised, that's what I'm talking about. Incised is a cut.